Okay, everybody, let's do Winery Equipment 1. This is the first in a three-part lecture series. So I'm going to go with a little overview, and we're going to talk about the concept of winery throughput. So the idea here is to look at strictly fruit processing. So the first thing I want to talk about is winery throughput. How do you take a winery, think of it as a pipeline, and push wine through it in a reasonable way? So that's the first part of this series. Then we're going to have two other lectures that I'm going to post up. Try and keep them short, keep you engaged. And the other one we're going to talk about is winery equipment. We're going to talk about the fruit processing, power requirements, tanks, presses, refrigeration, fittings, and hoses. And I'm going to keep it pretty light, kind of a 10,000 foot overview. And then you can ask us questions when we get to our Zoom talk on Wednesday. And then the last one is pumps. And I want to talk specifically about pumps because they're something that we use really regularly. It's important for you to understand all of the different types of pumps that are available. In terms of equipment, I think filtration and bottling isn't what you're going to be coming into this fall. We're going to be working on this fall is going to be really crush and understanding how these different types of equipment work, just so you've seen them before, you understand how they work. So none of it really comes as a surprise to you. And so we're going to save the filtration and bottling stuff until EV 204 and 205 when that's pertinent to you when we're working on wines that we're going to be filtering and bottling. So when we think about wineries, we got to think about, sizing a winery. What type of equipment do you need? And what type of equipment you need is very dependent on how big your winery is. Do you need a big fancy pump, a big, fancy distimmer crusher, or do you need a big fancy, anything, refrigeration, if you're going to be making a 1 gallon jug of wine? On the other hand, if you're a small family winery, this is the Gallo Livingston facility, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more as we go through this lecture series. Those white tanks on the left, right there on the bottom left, those are 1 million gallon tanks. This is the largest winery on earth. So it's important to understand that their requirements are going to be very different. It's not like they can just use a siphon hose and lift a tank up in order to get gravity flow. They're going to have very different, equipment needs. They're also going to have different refrigeration needs. Everything is going to be very, very different for this type of winery. Now, realize wineries in and of themselves vary everything from the Carboy winery, which there is one. There's a winery called the Carboy winery, all the way through to something like this. So in every stage, there is equipment available for you. So again, 10,000 foot overview, but we want to talk about the idea of winery throughput today. So again, this is one of those 1 million gallon tanks next to a regular human. So when we do winery throughput 101, the thing is what we have to do is we have to start with how much fruit we're going to take in. And we need to size our tanks, our fermenters, our everything on those incoming loads. So what we have to do is also look for a limiting factor. Where is our pinch point? So at College Cellars, we have 2 pinch points. Number one, it's our distimmer and our crushing system. And so the way that is set up is we can't really continuously load the system you guys did last year, where we set bins up on top and we dump them into distimmers. And then we'd have to stop, take the bin down, everything else like that. That's a really slow process. We also had people climbing up and down ladders. So we did away with that. As a matter of fact, over the next few weeks, you're going to see us assemble a whole new crush pad out there because that was really slowing us down. Our other big slowdown pinch point is our presses. They're very small. So this year our investment was in the crush pad, but I think in the future we're going to be looking at upgrading our presses, looking for a little bit bigger press so that we can process more efficiently. Another thing we did this year in order to get more efficient was started to do flotation, which you guys watched us do. And that saved us a whole bunch of time in the way that we press. And I'm going to talk more about that this quarter, but we can change some limiting factors. So the fact of the matter is what you start looking at is what size of your fruit delivery is being delivered in. So is it coming in, half-ton lugs? Is it coming in 1-ton lugs? Or is it coming in, gondolas that are coming from the vineyard that hold about 22 tons? So if you're going to hold 22 to 25 tons, you're going to want to, size your fermenters at either 25, 50, 75, or 100-ton increments so that you can take that fruit and put it in there. So the other side is that if you're going to estate, also plant your vineyard blocks to match the equipment. So at College Cellars, we've actually done that really well because we do quarter-acre blocks. We grow between 5 and 6 tons per acre, which gives us somewhere between 4 and 6 tons per acre, which gives us between 1 and 1.5 tons per block. So that means that one block of Carmenere goes perfectly into 1.5 ton fermenter. One block of Tempranillo, which we don't have anymore, Syrah, goes into 1.5 ton fermenter. And then our larger blocks, we can either put in four fermenters, or we can pretty much fit in the Big Woody, which holds around 4 tons. So our fermenters are very much sized for our winery. So let's talk about Winery Throughput 101. The big choke point typically is presses. Especially with white wine, pressing is really tough. Bringing in fruit, having to fill up a vessel, press it, empty it, get it to a tank, get it clarified, and get it moved on is really tough. So every winery that produces a lot of white wine, their big pinch point and how much they can take in is a press. So what I want to do is show you some different ideas on how we do things. So basically, when we start thinking about juice, they're all a little different. So some things are not very juicy. Viognier is particularly nasty at this. Viognier is not very juicy. You'll be lucky to get 500 liters per ton, which is maybe 130, 140 gallons per ton. On the other end of the equation, I've seen 800 liters per ton out of Sauvignon Blanc. Very, very juicy, which is closer to 200 gallons a ton. So, know your variety, know what you're bringing in, and know how much juice you're going to get out of it, because that's going to be important for how big you need to size your tanks. So when we talk about 20-ton hoppers or 22-ton hoppers, why? That's what legally fits on the road. So when we start thinking about big wineries, that's how they size, is based on those big gondolas that go down the road. We all size our wineries, and most of what you've seen so far, based on 1-ton fermenter. So I'm going to throw some bigger numbers at you just to kind of mix it up for you. So let's say we have a 20-ton hopper. If we want to bring that in whole cluster, which means it would be hand picked, which never happens in a gondola, let's just say for the sake it does, we're going to need a pretty big press in order to fit that in. Whereas if we, somewhere around 400 hectoliters, which is a huge press. But if we suddenly destim it, our press needs to be half as big, because we've crushed it up, we've taken the stems out of the equation, and that press has to be a lot smaller. Now, let's say we fill that press and we feed it through the side, like you've seen us do with Sauvignon Blanc. But because this fruit's already been mechanically picked and it's already all crushed up and it's going into the press, you can take off a bunch of the juice. And so you can dejuice, and so you need a bit smaller press. And so each of these gets to make it a little bit smaller. So if we have a 20-ton hopper of whole cluster, we're going to need a 20 hectoliter press, or a 20,000 liter press. If we destim it, we're going to need a 10 hectoliter press. That's going to be much smaller for 20 tons. And then if we axial feed and dejuice, we need an even smaller press, a 7 hectoliter press. Now, to give you an idea what this means in terms of reasonable size, our Booker at the school is 1.5 hectoliters. It's tiny. So again, the size of your press is what really dictates how much you can put in. So whenever you're calculating how big your press needs to be, take into account how much you're going to process. All right, let's think about red wine. Now, red wine's a little different. White wine are pinch points at the press, as you know as well as I do. You remember when we were doing white wines, the hours that I was putting in and Marcus were putting in, we were spending a lot of time pressing and cleaning, and then we'd go to the tank and we'd float, and then we'd settle, and then we'd rack off, and then eventually we'd get away from it. Whereas red wine, when you'd have to process the reds, man, you just bring it in and process it. It goes right in a tank and you're done. So the thing is that we have to know what our limitation at this point in time is. And with red wines, our limitation is our tanks. Destimming is pretty easy. It's going to go pretty quick. But your volume is going to be dictated to by your tanks. So the thing is that based on your tanks, the bottom tanks down below are basically the same size. The difference is their shape. And so those are also going to influence the way that your wine tastes in the long term. So basically, whenever you're doing a red wine fermentation, count on somewhere around 200 to 250 gallons of space per ton. So the best way to think of that is that if you're going to bring in 10 tons of wine, you're going to need a 2,500 gallon, 2,000 to 2,500 gallon container. And the reason I'm kind of going back and forth between liters and gallons is because we're in America. If we were anywhere else, we'd just use liters and your life would be really easy. But the reason I'm showing you these two tanks is that realize whenever you make wine, you're going to have a difference in that wine's going to taste based on the shape of that tank. So if you have a tall, narrow tank, you're going to have greater ethanol retention. That wine's going to make higher alcohol. So the tank on the left is going to have higher alcohol content than the one on the right, because it's wider and more open. You're going to have more ethanol leave solution. And then your extraction is also going to be different based on these two because of how you've got to get through the cap. Now, punching down the cap on the left with a big, thick cap is going to be pretty hard, but the one on the right, if you were doing punch downs, would be pretty easy. So think about in terms of what type of cap management you're using based on that when you start selecting what tanks you're going to use. But I want to talk about throughput and how tanks. So I want you to think about this for a second. You can pause the video and kind of roll through it. So how much stainless steel white wine can this winery process? So each tank holds about 6,000 liters or roughly 10 tons. So tell me how much, think about it in your head, how much white wine can this winery process? And if your answer was only about 40 tons, that's about right because you can fill 4 tanks of clean juice, but the last tank you never can use because you always have to have one open. So if you ever remember getting those little puzzles at the carnival that had like 1 through 9 and one empty space, and they were kind of like the original baby Rubik's Cube, you always have to have one space open to rack and move things to. So if all you had was 5 tanks, you can only process 40 tons of fruit. And this is the really hard part about making white wine is that once your tanks are all full, you're locked. You're stuck in place and there's nothing you can do about it. So it's a particularly unique conundrum to white wine production facilities because once your tank is full, that's it. Now, at the same time, if you want to think about why we start talking about flotation, I'm just going to put this idea in your head. If we had a flotation machine that was just external, we could suddenly turn that sad face at the end into a happy face because we could float the wine and have clean juice that goes into that fermenter rather than having dirty juice because you just don't want to ferment on dirty juice lees. So you could up your capacity a bit. So the idea here is that you're kind of stuck with white wine. Now, if we went to barrel fermentation, we change the whole equation on this. But let's just leave that out for a second. But realize with white wine, when you're stainless fermenting, once that tank is full of juice and it's fermenting, it's full. So let's think about this one. Now, how much red wine could we process in this exact same winery? We're holding 6,000 liters. Consider pretty much unlimited barrels. So think about that one for a second. And here's your answer. Probably 120 plus tons. And this is conservative. If all we were doing was 5 turns. So the idea here is turning tanks. And this is using the tank to ferment in, press out, and then rack to some barrels. And the thing is that in reality, you could probably do well more than this. And again, this is really conservative because you can turn a tank 6, 7, maybe even 8 times in one vintage. In 2016, we put 32 tons through Big Woody. And that was just one tank that holds 4 tons a pop, and we ran it 8 times. So we were able to turn it 8 times in one vintage. So let me show you what tank turns look like. So the number of turns is kind of based on maceration time. So say you're trying to harvest across a huge block. You work at a big winery. This isn't small boutique stuff. This is the stuff that most wine out there is made like. 90% of the wine in the world is made in really big tank farm type factories. Very little of what is made is what we do here in kind of what I call La La Land or Walla Walla Land. Where we get to use these really small fermenters and we all get to be very artisanal. Most of the time in big production facilities, you're going to see things done very, very differently. Now, I quite enjoyed big production winemaking and also realized that small wineries can only pay you so much. It's going to be harder for you to earn a large living at a small artisanal winery. Now, it's really lovely working there. It's a really great experience. It's very hands-on. However, there is no shame in working at a large winery where you make $150,000, $200,000 a year, and I have a few friends that make north of $250,000 a year working in large wineries, working as production managers. So, and they're paying a mortgage, they're living in a nice home, living a good life, still making wine. And so the thing is that you get to do a lot of different things. So the idea here with turning tanks is that you might start picking based on a giant block. Say you've got 1,000 acres or something to get through, and you start harvesting at 21 bricks, and you bring in what you can, and then as you progress, you fill a tank a day, for 5 days, and then you start rotating and pressing a tank a day for 5 days, and then you can turn those tanks. So you empty it and you fill them, and you empty them and you fill them every 5 to 8 days, and you plan that out over a period of time. And so what you do is you take some early harvest Merlot that maybe isn't quite as ripe, then you take it all the way through to overripe, and then you kind of have this arc where when you blend it all back together, you end up with a really, really nice wine from underripe, some green, some vegetal, to really perfectly ripe where you get all that nice and berry cherry stuff from Merlot, and then to overripe where you get that kind of raisiny plum dark fruit. And then you can blend them all back together and you get more complexity. So it's not always necessarily a bad thing, but generally peak extractions occurs after 5 or 8 days. So really, 8 days, it's going in the tank and you're turning it out. And so that's the idea. And tanks are emptied based predominantly on time, not on bricks, taste, etc. So they're bringing it in, firing it off with obviously adding yeast and getting it going as quickly as possible. And so, if you think about a tank schedule, if you just wanted to do, say, 5 simple turns, you do 18th to the 24th, early harvest Merlot, then 24th to the 30th, another 6 days, 23 degrees bricks. Then you do another one on October 1st, and then you move into Cab Sauv for a little while. And normally, if you're in Washington, you probably turn at least 1 or 2 Cab Sauvs after that. So easily 5, 6, 7 turns. Now, the image on the right is a tube-in-tube heat exchanger, because if you're picking fruit on the 18th of September, the 18th of September, things are pretty warm. They're still really nice out. They're comfortable, right? So the fruit's coming in warm, at least warm enough that if you're going to go ahead and pitch that ferment, it's going to start really quick. But as well as I do, at the end of October, nighttime temperatures drop really low. There's a reasonable chance that you're bringing in fruit that is, as was last year on, October 9th, we were picking ice wine. Which I can't wait for you to try, by the way. It's delicious. So what we'll see here is that when that fruit comes in cold, it's really hard to get those giant fermenters. Think about warming up 100 tons of ice if you have a 100-ton fermenter. Well, what you have right there on the right is a heat exchanger. So what happens is you pump the fruit through this, and it has a tube on the outside, and there's a tube on the inside. It's called a tube-in-tube heat exchanger, and it heats up the fruit so that when it hits the fermenter, it's already at 70 degrees, which is basically room temp, 70, 75 degrees. And that way, when you add the yeast, you get an instantaneous take on your fermentation, and that way you've got pretty much wine at the end of 6 days. So this is a way to speed up the process and increase your throughput. So if you're going to do cold soaks, you're going to do extended macerations, all that type of stuff slows your throughput down. Now, if you have a tank for every wine, you've got all the time in the world to taste and do everything based on extraction and take your time, fantastic, good for you. That's a really admirable place to be, an enviable place to be. But bigger wineries don't function on those principles. They're just looking to get that wine pumped through as quick as possible to get a consumer a sub $15 bottle of wine as easily as possible. So let's do a quick throughput review. Size your winery based on your projected harvest. All of your equipment needs are going to be dictated based on what you're going to make, red versus white. If you're on red wine, don't worry about getting the biggest press out there. You don't need it. If you're going to make a lot of Sauvignon Blanc, you're going to need a lot of big presses. Are you going to do stims, or are you going to try and do optical sorted super clean? You're going to have a different set of equipment requirements. And of course, how big your winery is really dictates everything you do. And also remember, your harvest timing matters. If you're only going to make one wine, if you're all rocks Syrah type of winery, you're going to be bringing all your fruit in a week. If you make wine in New Zealand and it's Sauvignon Blanc, you're going to make all your wine in 2 to 3 weeks. That's it. Early harvest, late harvest, you're done. Your winery's full in 2 to 3 weeks. Now, if you're college cellars, where we're completely bonkers and have a hole in our heads, we might start harvest in mid to end of August and go all the way through till Halloween. So we're looking at a 9 to 10 week harvest period. So that gives us the ability, as such a tiny winery, to turn a lot of tanks and move through the process pretty reasonably. And also experimenting takes a lot of space. But think about that when you're sizing your winery. Just know that if you're going to be in a monoculture like Burgundy, where you're bringing in Pinot Noir, you have to have all your tanks available for an immediate harvest, lots of space. In Washington, we're bringing in a lot of different things that might give us an opportunity to turn things. So plan accordingly. So wait, you're saying, hang on, this was supposed to be about equipment, and I'm worrying about throughput. So what kind of equipment do you need? Well, let's talk about that. The list is really simple. Just some harvest containers, weigh scale, grape inspection and sorting table, forklift, grape delivery, elevator, bin dumper, distimmer, crusher, must pump, fermentation tanks, barrels with wands, must lines, tank chiller, chiller heater, tank irrigator, tank washer, transfer pumps, transfer lines, storage vessels, pressure washers, filtration equipment, and bottling line. Again, we'll talk about those in 204 and 205. But this is the list, and it's a lot of stuff. And so that's why I wanted to talk about throughput, because every decision you make is going to base what you buy in order to fulfill all of these requirements. So stay tuned, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture.